Okay, hi Julie.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Thank you for joining me today. And it, I guess I've asked you to join me because just so excited that you've recorded an audiobook of your book, Resilience is Futile. And I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about that experience, because I know we were talking earlier that you mentioned there were some unique aspects to recording or narrating your own audiobook. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I released my book the day the pandemic was declared.
Yeah.
So this whole process has been very unique in and of itself. But what was interesting when the audiobook, so one, I got a lot of requests online for an audiobook, which I thought was interesting and
Uh-huh.
from what I've been told, timely in the context of COVID, where people were not really able to pay attention oftentimes to reading and sitting down and reading, but audiobooks spoke to them.
Yes.
So it was really as a result of like demand for it to happen. But then there was the logistical issue of how do you record a audiobook, which is, several hours of recording in a pandemic. This was stage one, when
Mm.
nothing was open.
Oh,
So
yeah.
there was this whole back and forth. And one of the reasons why it was almost given to a professional actor was because professional actors, voice
Ah.
actors, have setups in their house.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Um, so thankfully, I was able to work with the publisher to find a studio in Ottawa where I live
Yeah,
that was able, because it was at street level, so you didn't have to take an elevator, and
yeah, yeah.
you didn't like, it was this whole logistical nightmare. So that was fairly unique, and we were all just kind of figuring out what that would look like. But I think for me, what made it particularly an intense experience, not necessarily bad, but intense, is that my book is very visual. And
Hmm.
in the book, after each chapter, there's copies of letters that I received from my stalker. There's legal
Yes.
documents,
Yes.
and I had to read those aloud
Oh,
because it's an
goodness.
audiobook,
Yeah.
which is absolutely fair. Folks, should absolutely get the fulsome experience if they're listening to it. Um, but it meant that I had to read notes written in his voice.
Oh, I
I had
see.
to read notes that he wrote to me
Yes.
verbatim. I had to
Oh,
look at
goodness.
notes in his handwriting and read them aloud as though I was him. And that was a really difficult
Mm.
process. I think it was important to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it adds to the audiobook experience, but
Mm-hmm.
that was by and far the most difficult,
Mm-hmm.
I think, part of the whole book experience overall, was having to put myself in his shoes
Oh,
to read these
goodness.
letters
Yeah.
in the way in which that they were intended. Some of them are poetry, so I had to like find the cadence, and like just all of these things that I never thought in a million years I would ever have to do.
And in a sense, you had to present him with his best foot forward, kind of in the sense of the spirit of the words that you're not reading it critically, you're reading it through his voice. Yeah. That
Yeah,
would be
and so
difficult.
I was like embodying him,
Yeah.
and that was a very it was a very surreal experience. And the other thing I would say too that was very powerful for me in the process was that the sound engineer, who because of COVID was in like a different booth and it was this whole thing, he had never read my book.
Oh, I
And
see.
so he was reacting in real time
Yeah,
to
yeah.
me reading it.
So you
And
could play off that. Yeah, you could use
yeah, and
that.
like
Yeah.
his almost like his validation that this was
Mhm.
really an intense experience, because I would read something that I've, read 1,000 times
Yeah.
when I was writing it, and then he would sit there and say, he did that? Like he
Oh, yeah.
wrote that? Like he would
Yeah,
just
yeah.
be like, woo.
Yeah.
So at every break I was almost like debriefing with
Yeah,
him,
yeah.
but because he was reacting to it. So it was a very intense experience, frankly.
Yeah. So you had actually a sounding board while you were recording it, which helped you get through the chapters, I guess, in that sense.
For
What
sure.
was it strange to be reading, because it's an autobiography of your own trauma and your own that you're being stalked. Was it strange to read your own words in almost like a third person, like, because it's your words, but you're also narrating yourself as if you were an actress, right? In the sense that you were.
Yeah.
Was there a weird moment where you felt, oh, this is this other person, because I have moved on, maybe, or I'm different now? Did you experience this notion of disconnect from the words, or were the words completely resonating the way in the moment that you wrote them?
I would say it was both. At first, it was very Surreal, because for so long the only way I could talk about my story was to disassociate.
Yes.
And so to have to focus really hard on the enunciation of every word meant that
Yeah.
I had to stop myself and say, okay, are we going to disassociate and just enunciate, or are we going to sit in it
Oh, yes.
and really
Yes.
embody it? And
Yeah.
so that was my kind of pickle at the
Yeah.
start
Yeah.
of like, how am I going to get through this to
Yeah.
make it really great, but also to survive the process. But what I found at the end was that I actually found it very cathartic, more than the writing, because I think of myself as a speaker first.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been a public speaker for almost 20 years. And so
Yes.
when I think about how I communicate, I really ended up, I think probably at the end of the first day, thought to myself, oh, I'm just sitting in a sound booth
Mm-hmm.
talking to survivors. And I'm just telling them a story. And I'm just trying to get them to understand that they're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to bring that energy to, I'm just having a conversation with survivors and kind of block out everything else. And that felt more natural to me than, the days and weeks that I spent at a keyboard, because I feel like my
Mm-hmm.
communication style is chatty at
Yes. Yeah.
first, and then as a writer. So it was a real journey over, a few days of figuring out, how am I going to survive this emotionally, but also how am I going to make it that it feels as authentic as I want it to feel, and not stilted, or that you can hear my like kind of checked out mental state. Like I didn't want that to come across, right? Yeah.
But did you feel it was re-traumatizing in any sense? Because I imagine there are things in the book that you wrote, because you could externalize it. It's easy to externalize your thoughts in writing, but that some things you may not actually want to share maybe publicly when you're doing your public speaking, because there's kind of two voices, right? Did you feel that at all, in the sense that you had to, now I have to say this part, which I don't normally say when I do public speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. That was absolutely my experience. So there's a few scenes in particular, I talk about sexual assault more than once.
Mm-hmm.
The legal process, which was particularly difficult, those
Yes.
parts I usually, gloss over when
Yeah,
I'm speaking
exactly.
publicly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to have to sit there and enunciate every word and make sure that I
Mm.
didn't, slur my words or do what I would do,
Okay.
publicly. Like if
Yeah.
someone asks me about the police, I'm kind of like, "Brrr," like I just kind of get it over with,
Yeah,
but just be like, you can't do that.
oh yeah, yeah.
That was really, those were the sessions where we took quite a few breaks,
Okay. Yeah.
because it was like, okay, I got to catch my breath again.
Mm-hmm.
Because absolutely, when I'm speaking publicly, I can make that macro argument without having to get into the weeds.
Mm-hmm.
But in the book, I go there. So I had to go there
Mm-hmm.
in the audiobook as well.
Let me pivot to this other question that your title brings up. I mean, your title is Resilience is Futile. And in that sense, I think it is a major theme or pillar of the book, in the sense that from how I read it is, often we celebrate people's resilience. My kids just went back to school, and I know at school they teach kids to be resilient. That's almost like a kind of a key learning outcome that they're focusing on. And yet I think your book makes a very compelling argument that resilience is just an individual's attempt to deal with a terrible situation, which society has no mechanism to actually solve or help. And I think, again, your book points that out. The mechanisms that we have, courts, police, they're not very useful. So I'm wondering if you could just comment on that, in the sense of, is resilience futile, and what is it exactly that you were trying to get across? Because I think I understand it, in the sense that you think it's a social problem, and yet we keep downloading it onto individuals to solve for themselves.
Absolutely. So first, when my book came out in February, people within my sector, the violence against women sector, social justice world, were really put off by the title, because it's such a pillar of our work to say there's a reason to get up in the morning, there's a reason to fight, there's a reason to seek help, because your resilience can save you. So I understand our focus on resilience, because it feels optimistic and it feels positive and hopeful. I'm not here to tell survivors not to have any hope. That's not it at all, right? But the problem with resilience is that it allows us to ignore the structures that force people to fight so hard in the first place. And it really pits us, as you said, as sort of an individual responsibility. And so then you have someone like myself who people say, you know, look at her, she's
Sure.
thriving, this horrible thing. Instead of looking at,
Yeah.
you know, one, I just was lucky. And two, what message does that send to women who are visibly struggling, who are not here because
Yes.
they were killed or they took their own lives?
Yes.
And there's sort of inherent victim blaming in those who are not quote unquote thriving. But then there's also the double bind, where in my case, I came out about my experience of stalking so shortly after I came out in this big public fight with the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yes.
And so you had people saying, okay, this woman was just taken on, you know, General Lawson, and now she's saying she's lived in fear for 10 years. Either she's lying at some point, right?
Yeah.
Or it clearly wasn't that bad because
Yes.
she seems to be doing well.
Yes. Yeah. She seems so heroic. How could she be a victim? Yeah.
Yeah. And then if I had fallen apart, like if, you know, in my case, my coping mechanism was to just be very, very, very busy. But if my coping mechanism had been self-harm, had been substance misuse, then people would have said, whoa, she's a mess. You can't take anything this woman says seriously because she's a disaster.
Yes.
But then because I put up a good front, then you get to erase the pain of what happened to me because it didn't seem that bad. And so to me, resilience feels lovely. It feels warm and cuddly and kind, but I think it actually sets us up to fail. It pits survivors against each other. And it just allows us to feel warm and fuzzy instead of saying, why the hell did Julie have to fight so hard to be here? Why did all of these women not get those supports? And that's, I feel like it's a redirect from where we really need to be focusing.
So let me ask you then, in a pandemic, what should we be focusing on? Because clearly, I think we are still using this mantra of resilience is great. Resilience is, you know, amazing. And we need to teach this to our children. But in a pandemic, when people are locked down and they're so isolated, it seems like resilience is not enough to solve really a social biological problem, right? That's global. What are your thoughts on that? What are possible avenues of solution, I guess, or of a way out of this situation for us now?
Well, I think we're seeing in the level of discourse, I mean, here in Ontario, for example, where we're having skyrocketing cases of COVID that are clearly attached to unsafe back to school approaches. But instead, the discussion in Ontario and Quebec right now is, should strip clubs be open? Should nail salons be open? And, you know, there was a small outbreak at a strip club in Toronto, and now everyone's like, oh my God. Instead of wondering, you know, why are gig workers, which is sex workers and, you know, people who work in nail salons, why are they feeling forced to go back to work even though it's not safe? Like, where are the social structures? We know CERB is ending in 2 weeks. People got to get paid. And instead of us talking about why we don't have a safe back to school program, it's easier to say, look at these dummies and what they're doing and screwing us all over, right? And so that to me is, again, this idea that, like, sit at home and just tough it out. But yet, where are the mental health supports for the folks who are isolated? Where's the financial support for people who don't want to go back to work but have no choice? And where's the accountability on the systems and the people who use passive language, right? Like, the premier using this sort of passive language about, like, we all need to buckle up. It's like, it's your job to protect us, right? So there's this real, I think there's just a need for us to get angry.
We're not all in the same boat. Some people are at much higher risk. And
there was this beautiful expression I saw circulating online at the start of the pandemic about how we're all in the same storm, but we're not on the same boat.
Oh, there you go.
Right? So the idea that we're all in this together is easy when you have a giant house with multiple bedrooms and bathrooms. But also the idea that, like, we just got to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we'll survive the pandemic ignores the social structures that force us to have to be in this position in the first place. And so that's my frustration about, like, just be resilient. It's like, you know, sending a kid back to school when the world is telling them it's unsafe, not allowing them to socialize with their friends, and then telling them it's up to them to just be tough. Again, I think feeds that idea that like, suffering builds character. And, you know, that we're all just going to come out of this better in the end. And it's like, I think that's a really naive way of looking at the world, frankly, right? And shouldn't we want to end suffering? Like, you know, people act like that's my big pie in the sky idea, but it's like, as a progressive person who cares about the state of the world, when I act as though suffering builds character, I'm saying we should have some suffering in the world because it makes us better. And it's like, that's not why I get up in the morning.
So then that, you know, leads me to my last question. I mean, so then what are the next steps for you, in the sense that you've published this great book, you've done, you in a sense, this is kind of the capstone to your experience, that you are actually, you've survived this, and maybe accidentally, right, in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you're also very what's the word, thankful that you're lucky, but you are also perhaps somewhat resilient. And then now you finished this audiobook. What are next steps? I mean, is there a trajectory here, in the sense of moving forward, or is it more kind of you're just surviving, or is there a plan in terms of your next steps? Because it is so uncertain now for all of us.
Yeah. So I've had this idea for a bit that I think COVID has forced me to stare at, which is, taking some of my workshops and presentations and turning them into a book, so that it's easier, because it's, not conducive for folks to show up to workshops right now. So maybe creating some sort of guide for people to have these conversations at home. So that's sort of my next writing idea.
Okay.
But I also am planning to launch an organization next year whose work is on stalking. So it is astounding to me that it's 2020 in Canada and we don't have a single organization whose mandate is to do work on stalking. We don't have any organization who does that work, solely does that work. And so I want to fill that gap. And I think, that's my plan.
That sounds
for next
amazing.
year. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that way I'd feel like I'm taking this experience, and like you said, it's kind of my swan song, in that I've told my story. I've written my story, I've told it to you, why I made an animated film, like I've done my part with my story, and now I want to take those experiences and shift them towards those structural pieces that I'm so passionate about.
Well, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for sharing all of that with me today. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.